Auto World. My name is Bob Long, and apologize for our little digital hiccup, but everything is all set. So I was talking about the two gentlemen who have been great partners here on the show, George Douglas and Dan Watson. And Dan is going to be with us for the entire hour. We're going to talk about a whole gamut of things, including diesel oils. So if you own a modern-day diesel or an older diesel, you're going to want to get this number and write it down, 855-660-4261, or via the email bob@autoworldradio.com or bob@boblongradio.com. There certainly has been a major increase in the number of OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, such as FCA, Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, such as Ford and Chevrolet, in bringing in these new modern diesel power plants, which have none of the old bugaboos of diesels of the past. To talk about that and a whole lot more, let's welcome from the lubepage.com, Dan Watson. Dan, how are you doing?
I am just on the top of the mark here tonight. Great talking to you, Bob, and this subject you're introducing of both diesels and diesel lubrication, something that I enjoy talking about. At one time, I produced a magazine called Max Torque, and it was about the General Motors diesel line of products. So something that I enjoy talking about, and it's a great subject. There's lots to know and lots to learn, and most people don't have the familiarity with diesels that they do with their gasoline cars. But, hey, the diesels have been around actually longer than the gasoline engine. It was the first thing that Mr. Diesel himself actually came out with that engine in Germany. So back in I think it's about 1895, 1896. So been around a long time. They were first called heat engines because, they don't have a spark plug. And so they referred to them as heat engines, and they would burn just about anything from peanut oil to vegetable oil to, as they begin to make a better product like diesel, a refined product from petroleum. But, hey, it's been a tremendous invention from day one. And, of course, now it's got more complexity to it than the spacecraft that went to the moon. I mean, these things have really got some mechanical marvels under the hood on a turbo diesel engine.
And for those of our listeners who haven't experienced a modern diesel, all the things that all of the manufacturers were doing wrong back in the 70s and early to mid-80s, when it was the beginning of gas prices to gas shortages during the 70s and gas prices escalating, we had a number of diesels that were thrown into the marketplace. But boy, Dan, these diesels were horrible. And
they were. I had one myself in the Oldsmobile. Remember the old Oldsmobile line? I had an Oldsmobile diesel.
Of course. And it.
Go ahead.
It did everything wrong, just about.
Well, one thing, they took a standard gasoline 350 block, and they converted to a diesel engine. And they had problems with trying to run 20-to-1 compression in a block that was built for 8.5-to-1 compression. And it didn't take real long until you started having cracks through into the water jacket, because in an engine built in that kind of block over in the diesel world, they would have put some type of real improved steel sleeve in it so that it could handle the constant high-pressure, almost knock that you got in those era of diesels without eventually causing a crack in the block itself. And then the other problem was, and they had this even later as they started to make the better diesels, is it couldn't quite always get a transmission lined up, an automatic transmission that you could hook up right behind one of these diesels without it eventually coming apart. And anybody out there that understands the difference in these engines, a diesel can develop 1,500 RPM, where a gasoline engine will probably not reach its full torque until it's up into the high 3,000, 3,800 RPM. So if I put my shift points in an engine associated with the typical things of RPM, and I shift this thing to overdrive, right, to go, and that diesel doesn't care, it's producing enough torque, and I'm running down the road at 1,800 RPM, and I hit a steep incline hill and I'm pulling a trailer, it doesn't shift out of overdrive in order to go up that hill. It just stays in it at that RPM, but it can produce so much torque, it would blow apart the smaller overdrive clutch pack. So there has been a history of learning all the way around, but today, when you buy these new diesel-powered cars, and there's plenty of them, we're talking about vehicles that are doing 50 miles per gallon, some higher, some a little lower, and their emissions are so clean. I refer to some of these vehicles that you could take them to some of the American cities and they should get a reverse tax. They should get paid for cleaning up the air because the air they suck in is dirtier than the air they exhaust. And
so true.
Well, they're fine machines, and when we talk about them and we get into the lubrication for them, the one thing that's always been said with a diesel is you must maintain it or it will come back to basically, as they say, nip you in the butt, okay? Because you can't ignore changing filters, taking care of the oil, doing the preventative maintenance required on that engine, or it will later have all kinds of trouble. And little things like you buy fuel for your car, and if it's got some water in the fuel, it's a pain, right? It runs, it cuts out, so forth. But eventually you burn that out, fill up the tank. I think that's our signal.
That is our signal.
We'll be right back. I'll talk about some more of the stuff when we come back, Bob.
All right, that sounds great. Dan Watson is with us. He's our certified oil specialist, and we're focusing on diesel oils. 855-660-4261 or Bob at autoworldradio.com. Don't go away.
My pappy said, son, you're going to drive me to drinking if you don't stop driving that hot rod Lincoln.
Giving your radio a broadcasted tune-up. This is Auto World and your host, Bob Long.
Have you heard the story of the hot rod race before?
Open in this hour. Dan Watson, one of our go-to guys, the oil lubrication specialist with more than 25 years of experience, is with us, and we're going to be talking about diesel lubrication. And before that hard break, you were telling us about some of the problems with those converted gasoline 350 V8s into diesels. And certainly when you look back at that era, too, diesels, had the chatter. They had really sooty exhaust, and without question, they were very, very slow vehicles. And a number, including, I believe, probably your Oldsmobile, required 2 batteries to start it.
Oh, absolutely. It was all a different world because you're trying to take a technology that was excellent for commercial vehicles, trucks, even in Europe now you find, even back as far as the 70s, that some 60% of European vehicles are diesel, okay? So you would see Mercedes and Peugeot and BMW, all these guys had diesels everywhere. Mercedes, after our fiasco with the American-made diesels in the 70s and 80s, Mercedes stopped exporting diesel cars to the United States because nobody would buy them because of all the bad press that came out of those cars that were built that were substandard. Now, all that's come back, and you even see commercials now for clean diesel technology in BMWs and Volkswagen and Chevy. There's a Chevy Cruze that has a little turbo diesel in it that gets over 50 miles per gallon. These cars are there. They're excellent power plants. All the and ifs or buts have been worked out in these things. They they have such fine computer control, and what they've done is made injectors that fire at just pressures that we never even dreamed of. They're in the mid-20s, 25, 26, 27, 28,000 PSI pressure coming out the tip, making the diesel fuel virtually atomize into the cylinder, which then allows it to burn completely, because little known fact most people wouldn't really think about, but any fuel that drips into the cylinder doesn't burn well at all. And you have to get that fuel dispersed so that it's out mixed with the oxygen, so that when it sets it off, everything burns. So this is a millisecond down to microsecond burn. It's not like it's burning for 2 or 3 seconds, so it can have time to work its way through those liquid droplets. It's got to really be dispersed in that cylinder in order to burn efficiently. And these injectors you're talking about, the rattle, these things are quiet because the injector in a Chevy Duramax turbo diesel, if necessary, could fire 5 times in the 1 revolution at 3,000 RPM. So they're firing in time spans that are close to microseconds. They're firing so fast, and that's what they do. They're able to put just a little diesel in to start the combustion process, like a pre-ignition, if you will, and then bring the rest in so that you already have the cylinder slightly pressurized, and you bring the rest in, and it fully pressurizes, and it doesn't make a detonating bang, bang, bang sound. It's a controlled evolution. So this diesel technology is fantastic. There's only one part of it, and I would tell people you just need to go to the lubepage.com and read about it, or go to my, I'd say it's better if you go to my YouTube channel, because I did a presentation on what we call the regeneration cycle required to clean the diesel particulate filters on these vehicles. And if you're going to buy any diesel, you really need to know what that's all about and understand it, and then probably, hey, make use of me. Just send me an email and say what vintage of turbo diesel is the one I should stay away from, and which are the ones that all the bugs are worked out, because there really are some issues with that. And that leads us into lubrication. And why I even spend that much time leading into lubrication is because you really have to have sophisticated diesel engine oil for these modern diesels. They have very expensive, very high-tech exhaust systems. And the problem is you've got to be able to deal with that and not have excessive oil vapor. You've got to have an engine oil that will not contribute to high hydrocarbon output, soot, that is, and you therefore need an oil which is going to be very high quality. Running low quality oil in these modern diesels will cost you thousands of dollars before you're done, because in many cases you'll just be a happy camper, everything will be going fine, and you'll be gradually destroying your exhaust system. And at least in states other, let's say, than maybe Texas, or somewhere they don't have any restrictions on you removing all that exhaust system, in many states like California, they're not going to let you drive on the road unless that exhaust system's intact and working like it's supposed to. And to replace one, really, I mean, I know one person that had a Mercedes. Now, that was $14,000 to replace the exhaust. But we're talking about nothing less than $4,000 or $5,000, maybe even $7,000 to replace all that's in this exhaust system from the manifold back, because they got catalytic converters in the new ones. They also have what they call the whole name of the system is called selective catalytic regeneration. Okay, and it's designed to have catalytic converter. They use urea injection to treat nitrous oxide, and then they have a diesel particulate filter behind all of that. And this stuff it's grown from requirements from the EPA to clean up the exhaust, and it's very clean. But it is not something that you want to inadvertently destroy. So you have to pay attention to your oil requirements. The current diesel oil specified is now CK4 oil, okay? Now, we can back up for just a minute. I know we got a break coming, but we can back up for just a minute and explain to our listeners kind of what these designations are all about, like CK4 for diesel and SN rated for gasoline, and who comes out with these specs and why do we have to pay attention to them? Because most people, they go, I don't know what they are. It just says here CK4. I don't know what that is. But the oil I'm buying only says CJ4. Is that a big deal? I don't know. For my gasoline car, the oil I'm buying says SN, and my owner's manual says SL. Can I use that SN, or is that bad, or what does it mean? So maybe that's something we'll touch on for a few minutes after the break, and then I'll go on and finish with the importance of the diesel oil so people understand that. But that part about knowing the specifications, that's just too important to gloss over.
It certainly is. More with Dan Watson from thelubepage.com coming your way all across North America. Don't go away.
Broadcasting from the middle of Corvette Boulevard and Stingray Avenue, this is Auto World with your host, Bob Long.
I welcome you back, and thank you very much for being here. We've got Dan Watson from thelubepage.com talking about diesel technology, how far we've come in a relatively short period of time, and we're going to concentrate here on some diesel oil recommendations and lubricant products that Dan would suggest for your vehicle. Tell us a little bit about the AMSOIL lineup.
Well, Bob, AMSOIL has just recently, they have reformulated and have a new diesel line available. It's called Max Protection, and the stuff is really remarkable. I mean, we're talking about testing parameters and performance that really you'd have to see the numbers to know how good this oil is. But the great thing is that in almost all of these turbo diesels, the AMSOIL Max Protection oil can be used for extended drains. And we've been doing extended drains a long time. AMSOIL has a lot of information, oil sample analysis from thousands of vehicles, and they don't make these recommendations lightly. They're very careful about that. And we can have a new modern turbo diesel that we're going to give it 1 year or 25,000 miles as a recommendation for this CK4 diesel oil. And to tell you how good this oil is, Ford put out a notice that the CK4 rating, as they have tested oil, is insufficient to protect the Ford Power Stroke diesel, and they're adamant about that. However, AMSOIL doesn't have that problem. Our CK4 rated oil is so far above that minimum standard that Ford has no problem with AMSOIL's CK4 rated heavy duty diesel oil being used in any of their Power Stroke diesel engines. So it's just an example that AMSOIL doesn't make oil to the minimum standard. They're always making oil far and above the requirements to set those standards. And speaking of those standards for just a moment before we went on the break, to explain to our listeners that the American Petroleum Institute, the API, they established the classification standards for oil. On the gasoline side, if you looked at your bottle, you would see something like SN. S is actually for service. We in our industry, we kind of refer to it as spark ignition, S for spark or gasoline. But the truth is, in the manuals, it's for service vehicles, and that's typically gasoline. But the important thing to know is that it's for gasoline engines. The tests that are required to meet the classification standard for the API are established by the people who make the engines, okay? The original equipment manufacturers such as Toyota, Nissan, GM, Hyundai, Ford, Chrysler. These are the people that establish the test criteria to satisfy their lubrication. Those come together in a committee, and that committee of oil experts and factory reps and people, they come together and determine what they're going to include as the total testing. Then the American Petroleum Institute says, okay, if you meet all these tests, you can label your oil as API SN. That's for gasoline. On the diesel side, they do the same thing with the original equipment manufacturers and the tests that they have developed and called out for lubrication. And they have a C rating because C is for commercial, but again, in the industry, we kind of refer to C as compression ignition for the C, and that would be for diesels. And in that case, we're at CK4. Now, here's what you got to understand, because they asked the question, what if your car says to use SL and you see a bottle of oil and it has SN? Well, all of the current classifications in gasoline engine oils supersede all the previous, or in other words, they're backward compatible. The SN will replace the SM or the SL or the SG. It goes backwards. In the diesel engine oils, there's a couple of diesel oils that are kind of off to the side, a CF rating, and there's a CF2. So you start looking and saying, well, how do I know? Well, you have to look in your owner's manual and determine exactly which oil it says to use. Now, when you buy a heavy-duty diesel oil such as CK4 meets or exceeds all the other diesel standards. But if you found an oil that said it was CF2 rated, it wouldn't meet the CK4 rating. So you do have to be a little more careful in diesel. And one last thing on these oil ratings. For all the folks out there that own a European automobile, and there's lots of them in the United States, Volvo, Peugeot, BMW, Volkswagen, Mercedes, that's to name a few off the cuff. The Europeans don't have an oil standard as simple as ours. They have 5 levels of oil classification. It is very, very important for you to use the oil classification established by the European ACEA organization. That's their organization, like our API, but they establish these different 5 levels. And most people would be a little confused by it. If you go to your dealership, they're not confused. If you go to the BMW place, they're going to put in the required oil. If you go to the Mercedes place. But just be aware, if that's how you decide to do it, not to be confused, you may pay $18 to $22 a quart for making that decision just to do it through a European auto dealership. Now, you can buy these European oils. You just have to look for them. Amsoil has a whole line of European auto oil. It's called Euro Auto Oil, okay? And we have designed it into 3 classifications, actually 4. One, there's 2 kinds. But anyway, they give you, we cover all of the European auto specs. Now, even Mobil has gone to covering these European specs, and Castrol's moving into it, because it becomes, you can't use a standard American API-rated oil and think that you've covered the European specs. They're much more demanding in some cases. So that's a word to the wise to our listeners, is that if you own a European car or a European truck, you could own one of these fine Sprinter vans that they sell out there. And these Sprinters have a Mercedes 3-liter diesel engine in it, okay? So you have to be careful, because then, therefore, that vehicle moves over for its engine oil to be a European spec for diesel oil, not the simple American specs that we have, or North American, I should say. North American specs are actually determined by the API here in the United States, but they run for Canada and Mexico. They all use those same standards, but the European oils are different. And I bring that up because, boy, do I see so many places where there are garages and oil change places that are not aware of that. And they don't really deal with a lot of European cars. So European car comes in and they think, oh, it must take 5W30. It looks good to me. And it's not true. That's not the oil that it takes. So anyway, that's a word to the wise. Now, in our diesel oils that we're talking about, and in the AMSOIL diesel products, I must tell you that AMSOIL has decided in this area that they go for nothing but the most severe duty and the most high performance. These oils are just across the board. What a lot of people would say, they're across the board with intense overkill. But I've never thought there was anything such as overkill when it came to protecting a vehicle. So I don't use that term when I talk about oil overkill. It doesn't exist. It's not proper. So we'll go into some more of that, Bob, when we come back and talk a little more about diesels.
That sounds great. And again, shoot me an email, bob@autoworldradio.com. More with our lubrication specialist, Dan Watson, is around the bend. So don't go away.
And now, back to the show with the highest octanes, Auto World, and your host, Bob Long.
We are back with Dan Watson from thelubricage.com. He's our specialist when it comes to lubrication. And in this hour, we're talking about diesel lubrication, diesel, all different types of diesel oils. And boy, I think we're going to have to do another hour on diesels in the not-too-distant future. Dan, I've got a question here from Peter in New Hampshire listening on WCCM, and he wants to know about the formulation of the new diesel products versus the older diesel products. He's considering purchasing one of these new diesel-powered vehicles. He's writing here, are you guys telling me I'm not going to have any of the old bugaboos? Definitely not.
Well, no, he won't have the old bugaboos. With every technology, you can have your own current bugaboos, if you know what I mean. You don't have to worry about the old ones. Here's the deal. They've improved everything that used to make diesels unpopular. Bad smell, rattly engine. Don't worry about having performance issues or not having enough, get up and go. These turbocharged diesels, you kick the turbo in, have your head steady or snap it into the seat. They've got so much power, I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I always laugh and say, make sure you didn't hook your chain to the back of the garage for some reason. When you start off and want to go to work, you'll just drag the house with you. So, but here's what you have to know about these new ones. I would recommend to anybody that you try to buy a diesel that's 2011 or newer, or go back and buy one that's 2007 and older. And the reason is that in 2011 they put a different exhaust system in, this SCR I called it, selective catalytic regeneration exhaust system. And if your truck has a urea tank, you should be shouting hallelujah, okay? Most people say, well, it's a real pain out to put that urea in. Here's what takes place, Bob, and this is so easy to understand. Nitrous oxide is a production in diesel engines, pretty high production because of the high compression and the temperature in the cylinder to do that high compression. So the government says, hey, you can't produce that much nitrous oxide. It's going to create smog. It's going to create nitric acid, which causes us to have acid rain. So you got to knock that stuff off, get rid of it. So what do? They decide to put an EGR system on. That's exhaust gas recirculation. What that's going to do is take spent exhaust, put it back in to the intake of the engine. Why? Because there's no oxygen in that, or very little, and it will reduce the temperature of the burn in the cylinder, and you produce less nitrous oxide. That's called in-cylinder treatment for nitrous oxide. But what are you doing? You're removing part of the air. The whole idea of having this turbo system is to get more oxygen in there and be able to burn more fuel. So you're defeating your own purpose by putting this exhaust back in. Plus, it's full of soot, so it soots up the engine, soots up the oil. It's just not a good practice. Now, they put in 2007, 2008 timeframe, they put a diesel particulate filter in the exhaust. One of the problems you have is when you're doing this EGR and you got all this stuff going on, you create a lot of soot. And that's one reason I had to improve the oil, was to be able to keep soot in solution. So all of a sudden, you got a lot of soot going down the exhaust. Well, that diesel particulate filter traps it. Wonderful job. But it gets full. It creates a back pressure against the engine. The computer reads that and says, oops, too much pressure. And so what they did is on the exhaust stroke of the diesel, they puff in diesel. Not to burn it, but to push it down the exhaust so that when it gets to that diesel particulate filter, it catches it on fire and burns all the residual carbon out of it. It's called a regeneration cycle, and it cleans it. Problem is, during that regeneration cycle, you end up having fuel leak past the rings into the crankcase, and many times you're getting from anywhere from 5 to 13% fuel contamination in the crankcase. Now, they just started ignoring all that because years ago in a diesel, when you hit 5% fuel dilution, it was time to change the oil. We had trucks running around with 10, 13% fuel contamination after a regen cycle, and that's just crazy. That's not good sense to do that to your lubricating oil. Now, that system had a significant change in 2011 in general for this SCR exhaust because they said, wait a minute, if we use urea, we can cut down on that EGR system. Almost don't need it because we're going to treat nitrous oxide in the exhaust with a spritz of urea, which turns nitrous oxide to water vapor. Wonderful. It's gone. We don't have to worry about it, okay? And we're not doing all that EGR, so we actually took some load off of the diesel particulate filter, filling it up with soot because of the EGR system that's running so hard in a number of these trucks in the interim years there. Now, in 2013, General Motors, for the Duramax diesel, they put what we call the 9th injector in the exhaust system so that they no longer puff diesel in the exhaust of the engine in order to burn out the diesel particulate filter. They simply have that injector spritz diesel in like it's supposed to, clean the DPF, so there's no longer any fuel contamination of the crankcase in the General Motors product after 2013. Now, I am frankly surprised that the Cummins turbo diesel and the Ford Power Stroke did not follow suit and put an injector in the exhaust, but they haven't done that yet. So they're still puffing diesel through the exhaust, still getting fuel contamination into the crankcase oil. So if I were going to buy a new diesel myself, I would go with a 2013 or later General Motors Duramax diesel because of the better system of treating the particulate filter in the regeneration cycle and the fact that they do use the same SCR exhaust system with urea. Now, many people have different opinions on which engine is better. That's fine, whatever. I'm not into that argument. But there is no reason to continue to put diesel into the exhaust of the engine to go into that DPF. And we have another show on this. I could just tell you horror stories of little bus fleets, school bus fleets with the engines that do this, and they use a term called making oil because they get so much fuel in the crankcase that they're overfull and they have to drain all the oil to get it down below the crankshaft so that they won't be making, battered oil with the crankshaft because it just keeps getting higher and higher because of the regeneration cycle. So bad stuff. Now back to the question, though, in all of this, if you've got one of these trucks and they do get crankcase contamination, this is one of the things that I want to say about the AMSOIL Max Protection Diesel Oil. There's a test called the Kurt Orman shearing test. How well will your oil hold up if it's contaminated with fuel? We beat the socks off of everybody with that oil. Everybody. It is, so if you're driving a Cummins or a Power Stroke, you need to be concerned about how well your oil holds up with fuel contamination. Fuel contamination will break down the viscosity improvers, meaning that your oil will shear back and you will not make it to a 40 weight oil. You'll start with a 40, but you won't end up with a 40 because it'll keep shearing the viscosity improvers that are in that multi-grade oil, and along with its own amount of fuel contamination, you could end up with some pretty lightweight oil in that engine if you're not careful. So that's one reason to look at the AMSOIL Max Protection Oil, is how well it does against fuel contamination and shear back. It's an important aspect in these diesel engines. Also, if you're driving a Power Stroke diesel, they take some of the oil and use it in what's called a high-energy injection system that uses the oil pressure from the thing. It's not what does it. It's just using it as a hydraulic medium in the injector, the way that it works. But if your oil has any aeration or foaming in it and is compressible, it won't fire the injector. So you have to have an oil that has very, very good anti-foaming and de-aeration ability. If you don't, you'll have runnability problems, and you'll think they're crazy because they'll tell you, no, you got to change your oil. Your truck's not running right. What? Well, it's because the injectors won't fire because they've got oil that's got too much foam or air in it, and it compresses rather than fire the injector. Lots of this stuff available at thelubepage.com. On YouTube, under my name, you'll see that I've done videos with this. And also, I still have a website called Max Torque with two X's, MAXXTORQUE, maxtorque.com. A lot of good articles there on this particular stuff about diesels, and some articles on diesel lubrication as well as this diesel particulate system. I know we're out of time, Bob.
Yep, looks like we'll have to get you back for another Diesel Hour real soon. Dan Watson, thelubepage.com. Be sure and take advantage of all of the wonderful knowledge that he brings to the table. Thank you, Dan.
Good to see you, Bob.
All right, that's going to do it for this hour of Auto World. I'm Bob Long.
Folks, this is Bob Long, host of Auto World Radio, with great news. We have new sponsors. Nationwide AMSOIL distributors George Douglas and Dan Watson have signed on. George and Dan are two of AMSOIL's largest distributors. George is an expert in aviation maintenance with over 35 years of lubrication experience. Dan is a certified lubrication specialist and a U.S. Navy nuclear propulsion specialist with over 25 years of lubrication experience. These guys can answer all of your questions and ensure you get the best lubrication products for your cars, trucks, boats, or anything that moves. In 1972, AMSOIL pioneered synthetic lubrication for the auto world. AMSOIL provides the best lubrication money can buy. Ensure you get the best results with the best advice. To contact George Douglas, go to oilhelp.com. That's oilhelp.com, or call 800-887-6698. To contact Dan Watson, go to thelubepage.com. That's thelubepage.com, or call 800-370-2986.